for your presentation. Just a question in order to connect to what you said before. I mean, when you talk about economic or ethnographic of Palestinian camps, you talk about economic impact of Palestinian camps or Palestinian community living inside the camps. Otherwise, talking about economics inside the camps, we should also deal with so many communities living inside the camps that are non-Palestinians, and they are contributing to somehow to the economy of the Palestinian camps, especially after 2011. I mean, I guess that we risk to somehow to avoid a great part of newcomers inside the camps, and so that before we were talking about migration, that is something like under-researched issue. That's totally true. It's not just a matter of migration out of the camps, but even migration from other places into the camps that's happening nowadays after 2011. And concerning really economic business plan, if we can say, and nowadays I guess that I listened before that there are some people from the Dawi camp, and I guess that for sure they know better than me, that they've done the research just for 1 year, but it's plenty of economical activities now going on by Syrian or by Palestinian coming from Syria, but till 2011 when we were asking that vote. How somehow we can include, if we want to include these issues and the ethnographical impact of the Palestinian camps.
Well, one of the paragraphs that I missed, I skipped, was about the fact that camps are demographically very mixed now. Yeah, and in what ways does this affect my argument? I think that in spite of the mixture, the kind of political representativeness of the camps remains. The fact that even though they're demographically very mixed, they include now, refugees from Syria and Lebanese and so on, and have been for quite a long time. In fact, quite a long time ago there was a paper on Shatila asking if it's still a Palestinian camp. And yet it still is. I mean, people still visit it as a Palestinian camp. And so there's a sort of slippage here between the demographic reality and kind of political, symbolic representativeness. And I don't know where that will lead to. I mean, Durai, the urbanist who did studies of integration between urban camps and the Lebanese population around, suggests that these camps have for a long time actually been low-rent areas for migrants from other areas, workers from Africa, for instance. But in a way, this hasn't sort of affected perceptions of them much up to now, I don't think. And from what I know, which is not really very much, about Palestinians who move out and Lebanese who move in, they're integrated to a large extent, by neighborliness, this neighborliness that I mentioned but didn't elaborate, which means that very quickly there's actually, I'm always doing this, an MA study by an AUB student about a refugee family from Syria in Shatila camp. And what's very interesting is how quickly relationships build up between the Syrian, although you hear stories of how refugees from Syria are actually resented, talk about this by local Palestinians. Yet this research thesis shows that very, very quickly relations were built up, friendships between the daughters. One of the daughters from Syria starts working in a Lebanese NGO, makes friends, brings friends home. How a suitor from a local suitor turns up. How the mother works finds work. I mean, all types of integration seem to happen very, very fast. So I'm not sure that this demographic change that you're right about is making that much difference to practices in camps. I mean, actually, you could direct the question to my friend Khaloud, who I rely on a lot for what little I know about this, because she lives in Buri Farajli and knows on an everyday level how people connect or don't connect.
just have one last question. At such bleak and desperate moment, how do you think research and advocacy should be focused and utilized for the benefit of the Palestinian communities in Lebanon? And what's the necessity now to be focused on, since our workshop is about research? What kind of research do you think is needed at the moment in the camps?
Well, I think I suggested what they could do. I think research on women's economic agency is what I'm mainly focusing here. Like, how does it get blocked? Potentially, I assume it's there, and how it's actually carried out in what many different forms. But what's interesting, I think, is something that's implied in your question, is how is this information used and disseminated, and why it hasn't been more. I think that things that the Palestinian, the study of Palestine, the Institute for Palestinian Studies have published, have not really made as much impact as they could in the rest of the world because of the way books are distributed or not distributed. For instance, Nafis Nizal's study, which was carried out in the early 1970s about why people from the Galilee area had left Palestine, which I think was published in 1978 and 1979.
I think 69.
It was done in the early 1970s, Mahmoud, I think, and published in late 1970s. See, that book, if it had been published by the Syracuse University Press, let's say, or the Columbia University Press, might have had a real impact on Western scholarship and knowledge. But because it was published by the Institute of Palestine Studies in Beirut that nobody had ever heard of, it didn't get around the world and didn't make much impact, I think. But hopefully that's changing. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah. I just want to say last thing. Do you think it's too controversial to start a research on resistance and as a way back for Palestinian resistance and the revolution? Is that too controversial now? Is that such a taboo?
No, it's absolutely the right time, I think.
No one seems to be talking about resistance as a main aspect of the Palestinian diaspora, because the Palestinian diaspora started the resistance.
Well, the Oral History Archives program at AUB that Hannah Suleiman and Kaukab are talking about tomorrow is part of a revival, I think, of interest. Because those oral histories do contain stories of resistance in the PLO period. And I think that there is a renewal of perhaps the right amount of time has passed since the 60s and 70s for a renewal, because these things do very much go in cycles. You have the death of a topic, then you have the renaissance of a topic. I have a feeling that it's not very substantiated, that time of the resistance movement that's coming back, and there will be more research and memories of it. But that's just a subjective view.
Allah yasma' minnik, as you say. You should come back.
Any more questions, comments? Well, thank you, Rosemary.
Thank you.
We'll see you tomorrow at 9.